am indeed here to talk to you about whiteness, but maybe I should tell you a little bit about myself first and why I want to talk to you about whiteness. First off, as I was introduced, my name is Dr. Myriam François. I'm a political scientist by training with a PhD from Oxford, examining post-colonial resistance to Western hegemony in North Africa. And these days, I work primarily as a journalist and a documentary filmmaker. Now, just over a year ago, I started a podcast called We Need to Talk About Whiteness. For those of you who would like to listen to that, you can catch it on Spotify and iTunes. And the objective really behind the podcast was to explore the meaning of whiteness. Why did I want to do that? Well, largely for personal reasons, to be honest. I became increasingly aware in my personal life that many of my friends and loved ones from non-white backgrounds were sharing a sort of bubbling frustration with the lack of racial awareness, arrogance, and entitlement they frequently encountered in their day-to-day. Worse still, in many of those instances, other white people, were present in witnessing these instances, but often stayed quiet. Like many of us might do. You witness something that somebody else does, it feels uncomfortable, it looks wrong, but you didn't do it, so it really doesn't feel like you have to speak up. Only it became increasingly obvious to me that that's exactly what needed to happen, that we could no longer leave the burden of discussing racism or racial injustices or calling out racial injustices upon the victim of those injustices. And in fact, those of us who were witnesses in many ways could end up looking like or being silently complicit if we didn't take a stand. So some of these instances I thought I would share with you to give you a sense of the sort of deep frustration I was experiencing listening to them. One was a very senior Black academic walking into her first day in a very prestigious new job at a big academic institution and being instructed as she walked through the doors to change the bins, please, before she left because she was mistaken for the cleaning lady. And another occasion, an Asian film producer friend of mine had been told by a very senior film industry executive that she should count herself lucky to be at the table and that she hadn't been honor killed yet. That was received with rapturous laughter by the rest of the table. And so what I was hearing increasingly from my friends that they were telling me they had to hide or even shield who they are in their workplace, where their racial and cultural identities singled them out for differential treatment. The question was and is different from what? And as I delved a little deeper, I came across a term which first developed in critical race studies in America, whiteness. And whiteness studies as a whole field which grew out of African American studies in the US. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would look into whiteness studies in America. Now, what does whiteness studies do? They look at the historical and social formation of white identity. I began reading up on it and realizing that some of my favorite writers, from Bell Hooks to James Baldwin, had in fact written about whiteness and describing it in Bell Hooks's words, for example, as terrorism, in reference to the fear she experienced as a child walking through a white neighborhood. I'd never really heard white identity described in those terms. In fact, what I realized was I'd never really thought about white identity. I'd never really given much thought to what it meant to be racialized as white, because I'd largely assumed it was a neutral and meaningless identity. What I realized was, of course, that that whiteness is so normative, that it's so deeply embedded in our society that we, as white people, are rarely aware of its significance, and particularly if we're not listening to how whiteness is experienced by those who are excluded to it. What that meant is that I felt the need to confront that meaning, to understand what white racial identity means to those excluded from it, and to try and understand that as a signifier that I was carrying unwittingly in my day-to-day, with clear implications for my interactions, but which I was largely, and remain in many ways, largely unaware of, even as I talk to you now. One of the best quotes in this area, which I always refer to, is David Wallace Foster, who refers to the fish in water. I describe whiteness as the water. One fish is swimming along and crosses another fish and says, hey, how's the water today? And the other fish says, what water? That's basically how I conceptualize whiteness in my day-to-day. We're all swimming in it. Some of us are aware that it's there, and others are so used to it that we never really give it another thought, because we're swimming with the current and it's never swimming against us. Now, what I also came to realize, that whilst a lot of interrogation was being placed upon my Black or Asian friends, that, what's it like to be Black? Or how many times have I heard someone say to one of my friends, what's it like to be an Asian woman? And yet I realized we so rarely interrogate the meaning of white racial identity. So I started to get into a habit of trying to ask people, so what's it like being white? Not in a flippant way, not in a way that was deliberately trying to be confrontational, but really trying to assess people's reactions when you start to ask that question. And so my starting point really for the podcast and for the website was to explore the meaning of whiteness, both as it's conceptualized as those who are racialized as white and those who are not. Now, caveat, and quite an important one, is the idea that race, of course, is a construct. There's no biological, scientific rootedness to race. Race is a theory that was developed to justify what I call race, a category of power. And what I mean by that is that it emerged in a context in which different groups needed to be divided in order to advance the interests of what was at that time the 1%. Probably still the 1%. And so in that sense, although race is a construct, racism, which is the outcome of that construct that was created to justify hierarchies of human value, and then to justify things like slavery and colonialism and imperialism, and unequal treatment of people more broadly in society along racial lines, that continues to have a very real world impact on people's lives even to this day. So what is whiteness? Well, you'll find a few definitions online if you want. I think of whiteness as an interconnected system of power, which from the personal to the political asserts the supremacy of white Western Europeans, their ideas, structures, and actions. And in so doing, forms what I refer to as a form of cultural myopia, which in discounting the value of non-European output is ultimately limiting, self-serving, and harmful to those excluded from this narrow perception of both the self and the world. So I think whiteness as a structure is harmful to everybody, but it's particularly harmful to those who are excluded from it. Why me? Well, to those who might be wondering what my racial identity is, I am half Irish, half French, meaning I am of European heritage. My religion is that I am a Muslim, and for most of my adult life, I wore a headscarf, meaning that I was identified as Muslim in a way that perhaps you wouldn't recognize it looking at me now. So why did I want to begin this conversation? Well, first off, for a very simple reason, which is I believe change has to start at home, within ourselves. And this is an issue that I have watched close friends and loved ones grapple with for decades. And it wasn't really tenable for me to sit on the sidelines and sort of bemoan this situation, or sort of say, well, I'm not like that, so it's fine. I sort of felt like, well, actually, I may not hold those views, or at least I sort of don't think I do, but I'm sort of not actively challenging them in my environment. And that for me didn't feel like a tenable long-term situation. So I felt a strong moral obligation to get in on the pitch. And there's also another more personal reason, which is, I suppose, that as a Muslim woman who wore a headscarf for much of my adult life, I feel like I have experienced whiteness firsthand, meaning that when I wore a headscarf more consistently, I was regularly racialized as excluded from whiteness, as non-white. White people who identify as white or identified as white would frequently assume that I was not of the same racial category. And that led me to a whole load of interesting and quite worrying experiences over the course of my life. So what did it feel like? What does it feel like being excluded from whiteness and then, having the quote unquote privilege of slipping back into it? Well, what being excluded from whiteness felt like to me was like being an outsider. It felt like being viewed with suspicion, walking into a shop, having a security guard follow me around. It felt like having a question mark, hanging over my worth, which needed to be proven in every interaction and conversation, whereas other people's worth was simply a given.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.